So first things first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Molly Middleton. I'm the recruiting manager here at Praxent. I've been here for a little over 3 years now. I'm responsible for all things recruiting. Fun fact, when I first joined the organization, we had just started our recruiting in Latin America. Now, about 60% of our team members are located in Latin America. So it's been a fun journey so far.
I'm a principal software engineer here at Praxent. I've been here for a little bit more than 8 years, and I specialize mainly in JavaScript, but I kind of am all over the place. Like at a certain point, I was working with Swift. At a certain point, I was working PHP, Drupal, WordPress, all that good stuff. And fun fact about me, I got into programming because like when I was 12 or 11, I wanted to make a video game that was like very similar to Zelda. And then 8 years later or something ridiculous, I realized that was like a valuable skill and I had no clue. I was like, oh, cool, I'll just keep doing this. I already like doing it.
I'm Ryan Ayers. I'm the principal software engineer here at Praxent. I've been with the company for about 2 years now, a little bit over 2 years, and been working in the software industry for about 10 years. I also started programming sort of for similar reasons around about the same age. I think I started programming about 10, but yeah, just had interest in video games and wanted to learn more about it. And yeah, eventually it turned into a career.
I can start that question by answering, we can't speak for all US-based companies, but speaking for Praxent specifically, how would you two answer that question?
I would say, I mean, English proficiency is definitely big. We definitely have other team members that speak Spanish or Portuguese, but the majority of our clients speak English and there is some client interaction. But I'd say the biggest things is being hungry to constantly be learning and growing. And then the second thing, being humble enough to be like a team player to collaborate, because we're really big on collaboration here. It's very rare that you'll be working in a silo. And even if you are like in those instances, you'll still have the ability to sync with maybe another team member who's worked on something similar in the past. And then the last thing I would say is to be smart socially. That's mainly to interact with the client and be able to understand their pain points and how to solve that pain. And then the second thing is, again, to be able to collaborate with an emphasis on results. And I'll pass it to Ryan.
It's definitely really important that you're able to learn new technologies because we do jump around a little bit, and collaboration is really important here as well.
What technologies are most relevant for me to know today, and what do you think will be most relevant for the future?
So I'm mostly open source person. I started with PHP. So I kind of just kept doing that. But I would say in today's environment, what the biggest things I've been seeing is React, React Native, and Node.js, and then also SQL, of course, for database management. And then for the future, I would say, I mean, if I have to guess, I'm going to say cross-platform technologies like Flutter, things like AWS and Azure for scaling as some of these new businesses get larger and larger. And then Next.js for backend, and then machine learning for anything that helps with like automation. I don't see that ever going away. So machine learning, of course, I would say.
Yeah, I think, again, you hit all the highlights there. I was actually curious and looked at Stack Overflow's yearly developer survey, and React and Node.js are listed as like the top two web frameworks right now. Yeah, those are definitely important. And then also, I think one thing that's certainly becoming more important as JavaScript sort of takes over is TypeScript. And that's something we use quite a bit here. That's really helpful. It also seems like Python is continuing to grow and become more popular.
In the past, my experience is that I would let my manager know what skill set or technology I'd be interested in. And that could be like a very specific thing, like I want to learn React, or it could be something much more broad, like my leadership skills are not very good. Like they're okay, but I want to get to where you are. And when I say that to my manager, because I typically have had really good managers with really good leadership skills, and of course, like it's natural for me to ask them, yeah, as I was saying, something simple like learning new technology, or something like a broad goal that's like continuous, that you always want to keep that muscle strong. And in addition, whenever I talk to my managers, this would be like a collaborative thing. So we would keep track of any wins. Like, for example, if I'm on a project and that project launches successfully, or if the client is like really happy with our work and they sign on for another contract, that's like another thing to celebrate. So we keep track of those. And then we would also keep track of lessons learned. For example, if I made a really silly mistake, or I said the wrong thing that caused like a bug in production, like a miscommunication, then it's not really looked at something negatively. It's more of like, oh, okay, so you made this mistake, so if you were to do that again, how would you go about doing that? And then sometimes I would even go back and celebrate like a win. For example, if I did some really dumb mistake on a project and then 6 months later I recognize that same situation and I don't make the same mistake, I'll bring that up to my manager, and so we'll also keep track of that as well. But yeah, that was my experience in the past. And then just like that constant conversation geared towards improvement and growth is what I believe got me from being hired as like an associate developer to now as I'm a principal engineer. So it goes associate, then title level, then senior, and now principal. I would say that that's been my experience. My experience isn't really going to dictate everyone's experience. So I guess it's my point. It's more anecdotal for me. There's like a more general answer to that question, Molly.
Yeah, I can take that one on. So we, the leadership team, is big proponents of growing all of our team members. So as soon as new team members join, you have access through an internal tool to this career ladder, in which you can see the different competencies of all the different roles within the organization and how you can get to each step that you want to get to. So whether you want to grow in a certain area or another, you have access to see all of that. And then every month, each manager is meeting with their direct report for a monthly performance development discussion. So you're able to talk about growth areas that you want to set, kind of like what you were saying, Rico, talk about the wins, things you want to work on and such as well. So it's more of a regular process for us, performance development, instead of like the formal one-on-one every year. You get anxiety about it. It's more of like the informal monthly conversations.
First thing I would say, junior developers, what I've noticed is that they tend to focus on small to medium tasks with more of an emphasis on like learning the business rules and the technology. So for example, since we work in fintech, I would expect a junior developer to complete smaller to medium tasks with some help, of course. And at the same time, they'll learn the technology side, but also the business side of anything fintech. So that means like learning the lingo, moving on from that. So title levels, I would say that they focus more on like medium to large tasks. And then with the larger tasks, they'll work with senior developers on the more complicated stuff. And then seniors, I would say they focus most on the most complicated items that need to be done for a project, with a focus on delivering results. And then there's some focus on architecture and planning, since that also is like a muscle that you need to grow in order to be a better developer. Because I think that was probably my weakest point coming up, is that I didn't really learn anything about architecture. Once I became senior, I was like, oh, this is something I definitely need to get much better at, because right now I'm not very good. And then principals, I'm still pretty new to being principal developer, but I would say that they interact with the client the most, and they also focus on architecture, scoping out technical side of the upcoming work, and then mentoring junior engineers. And then the last thing I'll say is that we also have technical directors, which is who I report to, and they do everything that principals do, except that they're more involved in the earlier like sales process before a client signs on with us. And then they also have much more management experience and overall mentoring. And yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything, Ryan.
Yeah, I think that was a great summary. I think one thing to add is that as your career progresses, you start off having very clearly defined tasks and smaller tasks, and as you move up, you begin to take on tasks with less clear definitions. You start interacting with the clients more directly.
What types of projects does Praxent work on? So we specialize in the financial services industry, meaning the majority of our projects are somewhere within the verticals of lending, banking, wealth management. We also have a lot of case studies on our website, which you can read all about the success of the project, how the project went, that I typically like to redirect folks to so they can just see for themselves.
When I open up my laptop, I immediately start prioritizing new information as it comes. So like if I get 3 Slack messages and then one of them is like, hey, this site's on fire, this needs to be like, I'll put okay, number 1 priority, this gets done. As soon as I have everything sort of prioritized, I can be in my head, or I can actually like write it down or put it on like on a Trello board or something. And then I'll address anything that's like super urgent, which isn't typical. Like maybe once a month I open up my laptop and then something super urgent and I have to like knock it out then and there. After that, it's anything that's like scheduled meetings, and most of those scheduled meetings revolve around planning upcoming work. And then after that, it's unblocking QA. So I would say QA is the biggest bottleneck, and that's not like saying something wrong with QA. It's just like a natural thing because we as developers can work on several different things at the same time, whereas QA might only be able to work on one thing because another part of the app isn't completely built yet. So they can't completely test something if only half of it's built. Whereas developers, we can split it up even much smaller. So naturally, things tend to bottleneck at QA. So one of the things that I've recognized is super important is anytime that they get blocked, to unblock them so that the development process moves a lot quicker. Because what tends to happen at the very end of each sprint is that developers are all done. Yay, developers are happy. But then QA has like this long laundry list of things to check because they were blocked by one thing. For example, there's a contact form. Let's say every field of the contact form the developers built, but then the developer didn't finish like the last field of the contact form until the very end of the sprint. Well, they can't test any of that till the very end of the sprint. So that's why I tend to prioritize QA more so than doing like a PR review. So then after that's done, assuming there's no blockers in QA, then I'll work with peer reviews, answering questions, stuff like that. And then everything else is just like the typical stuff, which is prepping upcoming work and then just actually coding and working on normal priority features and bugs. And I'll pass it to Ryan.
I agree with everything you just said there. I think one important thing to add is that we typically follow an agile scrum process. So we work in 2-week sprint cycles. I mean, that's pretty standard for the industry, but a typical day will have a daily stand up, and then kind of depends on where you're at in your career as to what the day looks like from there. The more junior you are, the more free time you'll have to focus on completing your tasks for the sprint. As you become more senior, more of your time will get split into meetings for various things, that sort of thing. That can vary a little bit from one project to the next and depends on what the structure of the team is, who's on the team. Generally, that's going to be a technical director. Sometimes it's a principal software engineer. It's like a smaller feature or something that sometimes is something that a senior engineer will take on. But yeah, generally that's the progression. We also do code reviews. So if in the process of doing a code review, we see that something isn't following the plan, then that's a good time to call that out and fix it.
On this topic, one of the questions that we received is how are the projects structured, or what do the project teams look like, which, as we discussed, already varies based upon the scope of the project.
I would say typically there's 1 to 2 delivery leads, principal engineers, or a technical director, and then I'd say 2 to 5 engineers ranging from junior to senior, 1 to 2 designers, and on average about 2 QAs. I've worked with teams where it's very bare bones, where it's like 1 delivery lead, 1 senior, 1 junior, and then 1 designer, 1 QA. And I've also worked on projects where there's like 13 developers, and typically whenever teams get that big, we sort of split into teams of teams so that it's easier to communicate the more relevant things to the relevant people on a certain team of team. Most of the time, from what I've seen at least, it's the initial cost So if someone wants to make MVP of a certain application for their business, then the initial cost is obviously going to be like a huge factor for that. So like one example is we could build, someone asked a question about mobile development. So if we could build the same project in native iOS using Swift and Android using Java, we can do that, or we can build it in React Native and sort of pretty much build both at the same time. And the React Native tends to be the cheaper option and the more efficient option. So that would be like a reason for initial cost. The other is maintainability by the client or by us. So if a client already knows that they're gonna hire their own internal developers after MVP is done, they're going to usually pick what the market has available. So for example, if a client knows that they can secure 5 Angular developers after MVP is done, then they're likely going to want to push for an Angular front end. And then the last thing is scalability. That one's pretty big because I would say 99% of businesses, I'm just going to throw a number out there, want to grow. And with growth comes larger applications if they need an application and stuff like that. So scalability is a huge one.
Yeah, so the only thing I'd really add is that if I've got the option of picking between different technologies or frameworks or something, I will typically try to go for whatever has the largest community adoption, because it's easier to find developers that know how to work with that technology. And so that makes it easier to hand off a project to some other team later on. And then also want to make sure that whatever we're using is actively maintained. And then I also have a preference for using open source software whenever possible.
This is a 2-in-1 question. Are you able to work on new technology or languages, and how do you learn new things?
Yeah, so twice a year we have an event where we stop client work altogether for 2 straight days, and we focus on new technology that would be super beneficial to us for future engagements. And we call those growth days, and it's 2 days, twice a year. In the past, we've done AWS, SDK, CDK, sorry, and some machine learning we've done, and TypeScript. We did TypeScript turkeys as like a fun project to learn TypeScript. And then another way is Pluralsight licenses. It's sort of like Udemy, I suppose, where it's general training on whatever you need to learn. And then other teammates, of course. So I'm always bugging some of my teammates about like, hey, so I never understood this. Can you explain that to me? Because whenever I read it on the internet, it's just like, I have no idea what they're saying. So sometimes I'll ping a teammate whenever there's not a lot of crazy stuff going on, and I'll just ask them questions. And then my favorite obviously is just after gaining like a little bit of familiarity with the technology, then I'll try and join a project or just shadow a project. And that's already like using that same technology in real time. And I'll pass it to Ryan. You got anything?
Yeah, I mean, you covered a number of the things that we offer. And as far as like how I personally learn things, I'll tend to go through tutorials, do like some small projects, things like that to get familiar with a new language or technology. But also just saw we had a question in the chat. How do you select to develop an app with React Native or Java for Android? And I think that kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier as far as maintenance and maintainability. So with React Native, you've got a single code base instead of 2 separate code bases. And that makes for a much lower cost solution. And it also makes it a whole lot easier to maintain because you don't have to know 2 separate languages.
Yeah, I'll just quick add on to that. So I actually did development on Android and iOS independently before React Native. I actually liked it a lot, but that was before that React Native existed. But once React Native existed, the conversation became like, okay, well, who's the client's audience? If the client's audience is 99% iOS users, then it might actually make sense to go native, like native as in Swift. But most of the time, I would say their audience is cross-platform, and what's available on the market to maintain the app are JavaScript developers. Since the majority of our skill set at Praxent, I would say, is in JavaScript, that's definitely another consideration.
as principal engineers, principal software engineers, you must have run into a plethora of challenges over time. So what's the one task that you won't sidetrack or postpone whenever it comes up?
Yeah, I mentioned this before, unblocking QA. Whenever a project's complete and we do a retrospective on what went well and what didn't go so well, the thing that typically doesn't go so well is that deadline for a sprint. Let's say we have a sprint from March 14th to March 28th. Typically, the thing that gets reported on what didn't go so well is that we'll go over the time budget, and that time budget tends to be because QA got all their tickets at the very end of the sprint. So if I can prevent that on any future projects, it's like a huge win at the very end of the project. Of course, there's going to be other factors that determine whether or not a project happens on time and on budget and all that, but that tends to be the most common for me. So whenever that comes up, it's just like my brain is automatically trained to like squash that as soon as possible. I'll pass it to Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess, yeah, that's definitely important is keeping QA unblocked. The other thing I'd say is any production bugs, anything that just make it past QA into production, that's always a top priority. Automated testing is also important, but can't claim that I've always gotten tests for everything, but it is really important for maintaining the stability of a code base over time.
It tends to be different project to project. So a smaller project is obviously going to be a lot easier to document what's going on. So I would say it goes in 3 stages. The first stage is whenever the architecture is first implemented on a project, there should be, and there typically is, a lot of documentation about how to set up the project, what all technology is currently being implemented on the project. And then once most of the developers are on-ramped, you almost have to prioritize documentation sometimes. So like if you know you have a ticket that's going to alter or make the current architecture a little bit more complicated, then in the ticket for the feature that you're going to build, there's usually some sort of line item that says update all necessary documentation so that the developer coming after you isn't looking at outdated information, essentially. And then the last phase of the project, whenever the project is near its completion, there tends to be some time, especially if we're transferring the project over to another development team. So like I said earlier, a client might have a bunch of Angular developers that they're going to hire. So at that point, we'll 100% prioritize documentation so that there's a clean handoff from our team over to their team. It's a tricky one because it's never like number 1 priority. It's probably like 3rd or 4th, but it's also very easy so long as you put it in the ticket to add that to the list of things that need to be done so that it doesn't get forgotten. Personally, I would say working solution, documentation second. I would say working solution first, just because that delivers the most value immediately. But documentation still delivers value. It's just sort of a delayed value because it's more so for the person coming after you. So in 2 weeks, whenever you're on a different project and someone else is taking over, that documentation becomes incredibly valuable. If there's no documentation, or if it's like completely confusing, then it's a net negative value. It's more of a timing thing because the solution complete delivers immediate value. Documentation is like, it's still valuable, but it's not valuable till later.
We have team members in 7 Latin American countries. Actually, all of us are remote. We're across 8 states within the United States, and then we have folks in 6 countries within Latin America. As for the process, it's the same as any of our US candidates. We have a phone interview, a technical interview, which likely you will meet Ryan or Rico at some point through your process, and then what we call a biographical interview. All in all, it takes about 2 hours. All 3 of those interviews will take about 2 hours. And then after that, we would reach out and let all of our candidates know either way, either whether we're extending an offer or if now is not the right time.